I was a student at Lehigh University 1 year before the war started. So a lot of us, as soon as it started, left college and went into different types of assignments. I had like airplanes, made model airplanes when I was a kid, so I joined the Air Force. Went into pilot training, but boy, I'll tell you, they had a fast program. And I didn't quite make it in pilot training. I had about 8 or 9 hours. And so the second choice was Bombardier School. The Bombardier School was something that was a little bit different. We flew a Bombardier school, 2-man crew, and it took us about 4 months to go through Bombardier School. They gave us a complete course of what we could expect in combat. From then, went to combat. They gave us a crew, got a 10-man crew. We trained for about 3 months as a crew, and then they sent us overseas. We were assigned to the 8th Air Force, which was the largest at the time, that was in England. We had about 40 big bombers on our base, and we had about 60 bases in England. The number of airplanes was incredible that was flying on a mission every time. The bird that you see here, we only flew about 6 missions on it, and we lost an engine. We left that airplane and took another one. Loaned that to another crew. They took it to Switzerland. They sat out the war. So that was the end of that airplane. The particular mission that you're talking about here was the first one we went on, and it was a nightmare. The bomb bay in an airplane in a B-24 is very narrow, and this catwalk that you see here is only about 9 inches wide. 9 inches that you have to keep your feet on, and at the top where your shoulders would be, it's about 18 inches. Very tight. You had 4 racks on there, up in the nose and back a little further. And on those racks, you had 5 different stations. And due to the shape of the fuselage of the airplane and the racks getting wider, at the bottom where it was narrow, you could put in 3 bombs. If you had 500 pounders or so, you couldn't put them in 5 stations. 2,000 pounder, 1. It was all you could carry. The situation involved here is that when you drop these, naturally, the bottom ones have to fall out first, then up the sequence. In this situation, before we dropped anything, just arming the wires, these 2 up here, 4 bombs, came down and landed here. These did not release. They landed on top. The props are just a small propeller. The wire that goes to the bomb comes down and goes through that while you're flying as a safety factor so that the bomb will not get, as we would say, hot. As soon as that bomb drops a couple of inches, that wire pulls out. The bomb is now hot. The bomb just about, maybe, and maybe not, clears the bottom of the airplane, and that bomb is hot. If you bump the nose, you're history. In this situation, naturally, the wire was out of the nose. After a minute of the air spinning, the props fell off. These bombs were hot. If you bumped the nose, you were history. They had to be picked up by hand, one at a time, and taken out onto this narrow catwalk. This catwalk was about 9 inches at the base where your feet are. At the shoulder level, you could just about squeeze through. Extremely tight. And there was space between these bomb bays that you see, between the one on the nose and the one back towards the tail, maybe about 5 or 6 feet apart. You could walk between the front bomb bay and the back, the front catwalk and the back, space about that far. You had nothing. No arming wires on the side, no rail, a very tight situation. That's the best I can describe it for you. And it's a very delicate situation, that's all. We had to pick these up. The bomb is about 4.5 feet long. And on the top is a lug about, not quite, you could just barely get 2 fingers in it. Pick that up, that was the only way to pick it up. The tail gunner did the same thing on the ones in the back. He did the same thing. We picked those up, and the two of us talked to each other to drop that bomb as it was. The pins were gone. There was a safety pin in it. The tail gunner took those pins. When he pulled them out, he should have saved them. He threw them away. So there was no way that we could make those bombs safe. They had to be gotten rid of. The question was that, of course, the two of us had to make sure we talked to each other. We both let go at the same time. The problem is the two of you have to let go at the same time. Otherwise, one of you is going to be hanging on to this thing, and you're going to go off the catwalk and go with it. Fortunately, we did get that coordinated, and we had to drop those 4 bombs manually. And it worked out. It was just a delicate situation, and handling live material is it's a nightmare. Maritz, France, next to the Spanish border. The target was an advanced pursuit field. No holes in our airplane. We didn't take any flak. The trip took 8 hours, 40 bombs. 4 of them hung up in the shacks, or what they call the racks, and we had to release by hand from the catwalk at 13,000 feet. We started out at about 16,000 feet, and we let down because of the situation. You take oxygen above 10,000 and wear a mask. You couldn't get out here in this Bombay area with a mask on. There was no way to have a hose or anything else, so you had to take it off. The bomb racks, the way they were designed by the manufacturer, were meant to carry 1 bomb on each of the stations. But it was a waste of weight, is what it amounted to. They put in the maximum number they could put in. Why that particular station jammed, we do not know. Electronically, it just didn't work. After it was triggered several times and we took the other bombs off the top, it released by itself. Now, if it had done that initially, we wouldn't have had a problem. You have in the Bombay a panel, and the panel shows each one of these Bombay areas, and it shows all the stations on there. You know by a light that lights what did not drop. So right away, we saw what the situation was. So the engineer, who happened to be the tail gunner also, he and I went down to look at it, and that's what we found. Well, the first thing was to get rid of those. We triggered the mechanism that releases them. It would not release. If they'd have fallen out by themselves, it would have been fine, but they didn't. So that we decided the only thing to do was go down there by hand and pick them up and put them on other stations. Believe it or not, after we did all that, we triggered them again. That station released. Why it wouldn't release when we asked it to, it wouldn't. But that's the way it happens. I heard of 1 or 2 other, out of, we had over 4,000 airplanes over there. So it was a rare situation. It hit us by a surprise, that's all, yeah. The first thing was you're trying to keep them from moving and dropping. Because if these had released, and these, which were hot, fell just to the bottom of the Bombay, they'd explode. Because the props had already spun off, which the prop is a safety factor on the bomb. And the pin that goes in there holds them, but there's a wire that goes in there also. The bomb only has to drop maybe about 6 inches, because the wire only goes through the nose and comes out a couple of inches. As soon as that bomb drops, that bomb's hot. We had to pick them up one at a time and take them to the nose section and hang them on other stations. And also we took some and we dropped them by hand. We had to sit there and say, are you ready? And the two of us had to be coordinated to both let go at the same time. It'd pull your fingers out of your hand. That was the big problem we had. to look over the situation and everything, a good 15, 20 minutes at least. That catwalk, it's 9 inches wide. And on the sides, no railing, no nothing. And at the top, it's about shoulder width. And to stand on a catwalk, fortunately, there wasn't any disturbance as far as rough air goes or anything like that. The airplane wasn't bouncing around. But to stand there on that narrow catwalk and do this and not fall out, we had about 60 airplanes, but they never all went out at the same time. On a raid, 800 to 1,000 airplanes. I mean, the number of airplanes that we had in England at the time was incredible. Main thing is, this is something that you're not trained to do. It was just an emergency that came up, and you had to do the best you could, thinking of what you were doing to save the whole crew. The survival situation, that's it. About 4 months. Yeah, the crew was together, going through training before we went overseas. This was the first mission. About 4 months. In England, we'd only been there less than a month. You're thankful to be on the ground. That's about the best I can describe it to you, that you made it. Well, you hope something like that would never happen again, but things like this, they did not train you for. They didn't think they would ever happen. This happened in, what was it, February or March, and I was over there until August. You stayed until you completed your 30 missions. And they sent you home. You told them that it was an accident that could happen, that's all. But there was different types of accidents that happened in different situations that other crews had to explain, had to talk about also. I mean, these things were, you didn't get trained in these things before you went overseas because you didn't know they were going to happen. You weren't expecting to have a malfunction like this that was going to cause all this problem. I mean, we went through bombardier school, got up, had 10 practice bombs on an airplane. We'd go out for an hour or two, bomb targets, and come back home and eat. No problems. Small airplane, you know, and you were not trained for this type of emergency. It was something when it hit you, you had to figure out how you're going to survive, and the crew. The war lasted about another year. And then I decided I wanted to keep on flying, and I took a job with a company in the United States, which was the largest at the time. They only had a couple of airplanes, and they were photomapping all over the United States for Department of Agriculture, engineers, and so forth. And I flew with them for 10 years. A lot of moving. I moved about 3-4 times a year. And the peculiar type of, when you're doing aerial photography, you only fly when the weather's nice. Blue skies, no clouds, no rain. We used to work about 2 days a week. But that's the kind of work that you have to do. You have to pay attention. You have to learn. You have to be extremely careful. And a lot of it is things that you were not trained for initially, that this was going to happen. This was a first-time experience. And they were the things that you just were not trained for. It was a case of survival. Nothing like that. I mean, we had instances where we lost an engine, you know, and things like that, but never had a situation like this. Basically, the worst things we had in combat, fighters, German fighters, when they came in at you, they took down an airplane. They were extremely accurate. Flak, which you ran into all the time, was fairly accurate and heavy, but it was nothing to fly through a great big formation and over a big city and have flak come up at you every 6 seconds or so and survive. Maybe you would get hit a couple of times, but it wasn't something that was severe enough to cause damage to the airplane that you couldn't continue on. Things like that, you know, you couldn't get trained for. But you had to run into these emergencies, and then when you hit them, you had to figure out how to survive. It's a peculiar situation. You can take damage from flak and get 2 or 3 hits or so on the airplane. Depends upon what a flak is. Really just like a hand grenade. When it goes off, it bursts into hundreds of pieces. That thing depends upon what those pieces hit that cause damage to the airplane. You can come home sometimes with dozens of holes in the airplane, but you survived and there was nothing critically damaged. You get 1 or 2 pieces, and probably hit an engine, it's gone. Or you can have a fire. That was the big problem. But fighters, every time fighters came in, they took down an airplane. You could take flak and fly through it, and flak on the ground generally has what they call a battery. 5 or 6 guns. Here, a couple miles away, 5 or 6 more guns, and they're all shooting at you. And you could, like I said, you can pick up small damage. You could get hit and go down. But when fighters hit you, they took down an airplane. It's a nightmare. That's all I can tell you. It is. You just, and it happened on the first mission, and you still had 29 more to go. And I couldn't tell you how many crews we lost in our group of 60 airplanes. I'll tell you, it was a nightmare, that's all. And some missions, no problem. Other missions depend upon the target, where you went. Warfare is a terrible thing, and this situation, I never had any. I had small emergencies on the other 29 missions left, but nothing like this. You had situations where you had electrical problems and things like that, and maybe. We tried to fly in perfect weather. We didn't fly every day. You flew when the weather, because you can't bomb through the clouds.
What Ray experienced was an attempt to better utilize the B-24 as a bombing platform. Since they were using 100-pound munitions, the bomber was limited in the number of stations where you could actually attach these munitions. So it would be limited to just 20 100-pound munitions, 2,000 pounds roughly. However, the capacity of the bomber was over 8,000 pounds that it could actually carry. And so the armorers came up with an idea of adding some additional munitions to each one of the stations. So they, as the operational reports indicate, and as Ray learned because of his very dramatic experience, they were able to load 40 weapons on each of the aircraft. But the problem was when you put those additional weapons in there and they weren't all on a single station, you had the potential problem where they may not all release properly. So if you look at the results of this particular mission, and I have those mission results here, 10 airplanes had to jettison some of their munitions because they didn't properly release. So they were able to carry more weapons, but in terms of the effective use of those weapons, in each of these 10 instances, because of the way the weapons were loaded, there was ineffective weapons on each of those cases. And Ray's situation was the most dramatic, because not only did the weapons only partially release, they jammed, so live weapons jammed on top of weapons that didn't release. So that's what makes his situation unique from these crews, where at least 9 other crews also had release problems. But when they attempted to jettison the weapons, they went free. In Ray's case, when they attempted to get those jammed weapons to release, they didn't release,
Damn.
which then prompted him to go down with Sergeant Waddle. They're the real heroes of this story, because together they went down, Ray supervising, saw the situation. There was no tech order, there was no emergency procedure that provided the substance for what they should do. It was basically Yankee ingenuity that said, we've somehow got to get these released weapons that are live out of this airplane. We can't land this way because they will jostle around. We can't even fly back this way safely because if you hit turbulence, you would detonate those weapons. So somehow, Ray and Sergeant Waddle had to get these weapons out of the airplane, and they did it literally by, fortunately they were 100-pound munitions, so that you even had some chance of being able to move them. But think of this, you have 2 lugs on each of those 100-pound munitions. They're separated by about 20 inches or so, 18 inches. Each of them, 2 fingers through a lug, lifted it off and carefully walked it down that narrow catwalk to a place where they could drop it out of the airplane. Any movement, any bumping against part of the catwalk, against anything like that would have detonated those. So they're fortunate that they were able to even accomplish this, and together they were able to do it, drop the weapons out, removing that extra weight. There was an extra 400 pounds plus on top of the 3 that were jammed. They were able to activate the system, and the other 3 released. They jettisoned. The crew would actually pull pins on the fuses. That was part of their pre-flight procedure. And then, so you'd have these pins, and then the wires would go in those pinholes to keep as the safety fuse. And then, of course, when the bomb actually drops, the wire comes out, the propeller on the fuse spins, and it goes so many revolutions, and then you have an armed weapon. That's kind of the critical feature to understand here, is this was miraculous. They didn't lose the airplane just in some kind of turbulence or bumping it, but to do this manually is just an amazing feat of courage and ingenuity. The 100-pound bomb was especially well designed for airfields. So that's why they armored that day with 100-pound bombs. They were effective against, they were particularly used against airfields, a German fighter base that they were hitting.